A peaceful moment shattered in an instant, leaving a man and his dog trapped between nature's fury and their own desperation. The river's current tore them apart, but the real danger wasn't the water, it was the unraveling of everything they thought they knew. Struggling to stay alive, they would face challenges no one could prepare them for. This isn't just about survival, it's about the truths that come to light when everything falls apart. Ready for the surprise waiting? Like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from and your thoughts on what's coming next. Malcolm Cole, a black man who had spent years seeking peace in the quiet, remote hills of the Appalachian foothills, had always trusted the land around him. With his dog Bishop, a fiercely loyal German shepherd, they made their home together in solitude, far from the distractions of city life. But nothing had prepared him for the terror he felt that day, when the river, swollen from an overnight storm, took his dog. The weathered, jagged cliffs and the winding, muddy paths were second nature to him, but the sight of the roaring river crashing through the forest was unnerving, even for someone who had grown used to the isolation of this place. Bishop was bouncing along the bank, as he always did, ears perked up, tail wagging with the kind of enthusiasm only a dog could muster. Malcolm smiled, but the sight didn't last long. In the blink of an eye, the dog's paw slipped on the slick bank, and before Malcolm could react, the river claimed him. The force of the water swept the dog away, dragging him downstream with terrifying speed. Malcolm lunged toward him, reaching out as the animal's terrified bark echoed in the air. It was too late. The river had already taken him. Malcolm stood frozen for a moment, eyes fixed on the distant splash where his dog had disappeared. His heart hammered in his chest, his mind screaming at him to move, to do something, anything. But his legs felt like lead, his mind too overwhelmed with the horror of the moment. "Bishop!" He shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. The dog had always been more than a companion. Bishop had been Malcolm's anchor through everything: the loss of his wife, the isolation of his own mind, the weight of a history that had often made him feel like an outsider. Now, as his dog was swept away by the river's unforgiving current, Malcolm's world seemed to come crashing down around him. He watched helplessly as Bishop's form vanished, the churning water swallowing him whole. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't even realized he was moving until his feet were slipping through the mud as he ran along the riverbank. His body acted on instinct, but his mind was frozen in panic. He had to get to his dog. He had to save him. The deafening roar of the water drowned out everything else, everything except for the image of Bishop's terrified face. His loyal companion, struggling against the current, was clinging to a piece of driftwood, now lodged in the middle of the river. A fleeting moment of hope shot through Malcolm. There was still time. The log wasn't far from the edge of the river, and Bishop might just have a chance. But Malcolm's breath caught again as he realized how impossible it would be to reach the dog. Malcolm ran along the bank, desperate, frantic. His mind raced with a million thoughts. Could he swim out to him? The current was too fast, too violent. Could he wade in, maybe grab a branch or rope and throw it? There was nothing within reach. Nothing. He could only run helplessly, watching as Bishop's small form clung to the log, the water battering it from all sides. He couldn't let his dog die. He couldn't. Malcolm's pulse throbbed in his ears. He glanced downstream, hoping for something, anything that could help. He was too far from the trees. The river's edge was all that surrounded him, a treacherous slip with every step. There was nothing here, only the river. In that moment, something inside him snapped. He had always prided himself on being independent, on needing no one but himself and Bishop. They had been a team, after all. But now, looking at his dog hanging by a thread, Malcolm knew that he couldn't do it alone. A raw, primal need to save Bishop gripped him, and he took off in a burst of adrenaline, his feet pounding against the muddy earth. He needed help. He needed a hand, someone, anyone to save his dog. He couldn't watch him die. Not like this. As he sprinted toward the road that ran through the woods, his heart raced faster, the sound of the river's fury still reverberating in his ears. His vision blurred as panic and exhaustion set in. The distance between him and the road seemed impossibly far, Yet he didn't stop. He had to get there. He had to. Malcolm pushed himself, feeling his muscles strain with every step. As he neared the road, the distinct sound of an engine grew louder, and for the first time since the incident, hope surged through him. He was too far out to see the truck, but he could hear it. He could feel it. Someone was there. Someone who could help. Malcolm staggered out onto the dirt road, waving his arms wildly as he approached. The truck slowed down, and the driver's window rolled down. The man behind the wheel was in his 40s, rough around the edges with dark hair, and a face marked by time spent in the elements. The man narrowed his eyes, looking Malcolm over as though weighing the situation before him. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gruff. My dog Malcolm panted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's stuck in the river! You have to help me! Please!" His voice cracked as he spoke, the panic evident in his tone. The man stared at him for a moment, then glanced over at the distant roar of the river. His eyes flicked back to Malcolm, unsure of what to do. "I don't know," the man muttered, hesitation in his voice. "It's dangerous, that water's fast. I don't care." Malcolm shouted, desperation creeping into his words. "I can't let him die. He's my only family. Please, you've got to help me." The man looked at him again, his expression softening. He let out a heavy sigh, then muttered, "All right, let's go, but we'll need to be quick." Malcolm's heart raced as he stood at the edge of the river, the sounds of the rushing water drowning out everything else. His mind was numb, every thought consumed by the need to get to Bishop. The dog's form, so small against the monstrous current, clung desperately to the log in the middle of the river. The sight of him there, helpless and terrified, made Malcolm feel like his chest was caving in. He had to save him. There was no other option. The man who had agreed to help Harold had already started unhooking a rope from the back of his truck. He had lived in the area for years, and while he had seen floods, this was different. He looked at Malcolm with a mix of determination and uncertainty. "We'll get him," he said, his voice steady. But Malcolm wasn't convinced. He had seen rivers tear through the land in seconds, and the thought of Bishop being sucked under by the relentless current was unbearable. Harold tied the rope securely to the truck before turning to Malcolm. "You hold the other end," Harold instructed. Malcolm nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, and took the rope. It was the only lifeline they had. "You ready?" Harold asked, already wading into the water, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. Malcolm's heart was in his throat, but he could only nod in response. "Let's go." The force of the water was overwhelming. Harold grunted with every step, fighting the current. It took all of his strength to keep moving forward, but he had the advantage of knowing the land. He'd worked in these parts long enough to understand its dangers, but this was something new. The river had swelled to levels no one had expected. It was a dangerous gamble trying to save Bishop, but it was their only chance. As they neared the river's edge, Malcolm felt the cold water rush against his legs. It bit into his skin, pulling at him, but he held fast to the rope. He wasn't going to let go. "Hold on, Bishop," he whispered under his breath, more to himself than the dog. They were close now. Harold was within arm's reach of the log, but every step he took was met with more resistance. The current was pushing back harder than before. "Come on, boy," Malcolm muttered, his hands gripping the rope tightly. The water rose to Harold's chest, but he pressed on, reaching out toward Bishop, who was still clinging to the log, shivering with exhaustion. "I got you, boy," Harold said as he extended his arm. Bishop seemed to sense the man's presence, his eyes flickering toward Harold, and for a split second, the dog seemed to understand he wasn't alone anymore. But before Harold could grab him, a powerful wave of water hit, nearly knocking him off his feet. The dog lost his grip. The log was swept away, and Bishop was left to float aimlessly in the current. "No," Malcolm yelled, his body tense with panic. Harold gripped the rope tightly, pulling himself back to the bank as quickly as possible. He knew they were running out of time. They couldn't afford another mistake. Hold on," Malcolm shouted, desperation lacing his voice. But it was impossible to keep up with the dog's erratic movements. Bishop was losing ground, caught between the current and the chaos of the river. The next few moments seemed to stretch into eternity as Malcolm and Harold scrambled to figure out what to do. "We need to move faster," Harold said, breathless, his face pale from the effort. "We can't risk him getting too far." Malcolm nodded, gritting his teeth. Every part of him wanted to dive into the water himself, but the current was too strong, and he knew it would be a death sentence. His eyes never left Bishop. He couldn't afford to lose him now. Bishop, still struggling to stay afloat, was drifting further from the bank. The current was relentless, pushing him downstream. His eyes were wide with terror, his body trembling with the cold. Malcolm's heart dropped into his stomach. He was losing him. "Come on," Bishop Malcolm shouted, his voice ragged. "Don't give up." But Bishop didn't seem to hear him. The dog's movements were slow, sluggish. His grip was slipping. He couldn't hold on much longer. The water, relentless and unforgiving, pulled him further away from Malcolm. Panic surged through him, but he couldn't afford to give in to fear. Not now. Harold, still clinging to the rope, reached out and pulled it with all his strength, trying to get closer to Bishop. But the current was too strong. Every time they tried to get close, the river pushed them back. Malcolm felt helpless. "We're losing him," Malcolm screamed. He felt like he was suffocating, his vision narrowing to the dog, to the swirling chaos around him. The dog was his family. He couldn't lose him. "I won't let you go, Bishop," he yelled. With every ounce of energy left in him, Malcolm yanked the rope toward him. Harold followed suit, using all of his strength to pull them closer to the dog. The closer they got, the more vicious the current became. Malcolm's hands were raw from gripping the rope, his fingers numb with cold, but he couldn't stop. Malcolm held Bishop tightly in his arms, his breath shaky and his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the rescue. The dog's fur was slick and heavy, drenched from the river, but there was a faint warmth to him that reassured Malcolm. Bishop's eyes fluttered open, his tail giving a weak wag, and for the first time since the river had taken him, Malcolm allowed himself to breathe. "You're okay, boy. You're okay," Malcolm whispered, his voice thick with relief. The roar of the river still rang in his ears, but now it felt distant, as though it no longer mattered. What mattered was that Bishop was still alive. Malcolm looked up to see Harold, his face pale and covered in dirt, standing at a distance, watching them both with a solemn expression. Harold's shirt clung to his body from the effort, his eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something Malcolm couldn't quite place. "You did good, man." Harold said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't think we'd make it." Malcolm's gaze lingered on the dog, feeling the weight of the moment. He hadn't thought they'd make it either, but somehow they had. The current had been relentless, and the struggle to pull Bishop from it had nearly torn them apart, yet here they were with the dog still breathing, still fighting. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Malcolm spoke again, his voice hoarse but full of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his eyes not leaving Bishop. "You saved him." Harold shrugged, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Just doing what anyone would do," he said with a soft chuckle. But Malcolm knew better. Harold didn't owe him anything. No one would have blamed Harold for turning away, but he hadn't. He had jumped into the river, risking his own life to save a dog he had never met. "You didn't have to," Malcolm said. "But you did, and that means everything." There was a long pause as the two men stood there, Malcolm cradling Bishop, trying to keep him warm as best he could. The dog's breathing was steady now, though still shallow. He's been through hell. Malcolm muttered more to himself than to Harold. "I don't think he'll make it if we don't get him back to the cabin. I can't carry him all the way." Harold took a step forward, looking down at Bishop with a frown. "The cabin's not far, right?" he asked. Malcolm nodded. "It's a few miles from here, but with the storm coming in, I don't think I can get him there fast enough." Harold's eyes darkened for a moment, and then he made a decision. "I'll give you a ride," he said, his voice resolute. "It's the least I can do after all this." Malcolm hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Bishop. He didn't want to put the dog through any more stress, but the cabin was too far, and the storm was rolling in fast. Time wasn't on their side. "Thank you," Malcolm said, finally nodding. He couldn't think of any other option. Harold quickly turned and headed back toward his truck. Malcolm followed slowly, carrying Bishop with great care, trying not to jostle him too much. The dog's head rested on Malcolm's shoulder, his breathing still shallow, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. When they reached the truck, Harold opened the door, and with some effort, they placed Bishop in the back seat, covering him with a blanket to keep him warm. Malcolm slid into the passenger seat, his mind still racing as they drove toward the cabin. The road was rough, bumpy, and the truck's engine sputtered under the strain of the uneven terrain. Every jolt made Malcolm wince, his grip tightening on the edge of the seat as he glanced nervously back at the dog in the rearview mirror. "He's a tough one," Harold said, breaking the silence. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He was lost in his thoughts, trying to figure out how he would manage once they got to the cabin. He had some supplies, but nothing for a situation like this. He needed to get Bishop warm. He needed to get him something to drink, and most of all, he needed to make sure he was still alive by the time they reached shelter. "You okay?" Harold's voice broke through his thoughts. Malcolm blinked and turned to face him. "Yeah," he replied, trying to push the fear from his voice. "I'm just worried about him." Harold nodded in understanding, his eyes softening. "You'll get him there. He'll be fine. He's a fighter." Malcolm managed a small smile, appreciating the reassurance, but deep down he couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at his gut. He had already lost so much in his life. He couldn't lose Bishop, too. The truck rumbled along the winding road, the trees closing in on either side as the storm clouds loomed overhead, dark and threatening. The wind picked up, and Malcolm felt the cold air seep through the truck's windows, but he didn't care. His focus remained on the dog. The distance between the river and the cabin felt endless, like an eternity. The road seemed to stretch on forever, but they had no other choice but to keep going. "We're almost there," Harold said, his voice steady despite the storm. Malcolm sat beside Bishop, watching his dog's chest rise and fall slowly. The warmth from the fireplace surrounded them, but the chill in the air still seemed to crawl beneath his skin. It was strange how something so simple like a fire could make the world feel so much smaller. His hand rested on Bishop's back, the dog still too weak to move much. The storm outside howled against the cabin, the wind rattling the windows and the trees shaking under its pressure. The thought of the river, the current, and how close they had come to losing Bishop filled his mind, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else, a sense of quiet despair. Despite Harold's help, despite everything they had done to save Bishop, a gnawing fear lingered. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the pressure in his temples that refused to subside. He hadn't realized how deeply the trauma had shaken him until now in the silence of the cabin. Looking down at Bishop, so vulnerable, yet so determined, Malcolm knew he couldn't just sit there helpless. Bishop was part of his family, and he had been through too much to let this be the end. He needed to take action, but he wasn't sure what to do next. There were no doctors out here. There were no professionals. It was just him and Bishop, and the weight of responsibility pressed down harder than ever. He stood up, pacing back and forth across the small room, unable to stay still. Harold, who had remained quiet since they arrived, watched him from the corner of the room, his expression unreadable. "What's going on, Malcolm?" Harold asked, his voice breaking the silence. Malcolm stopped his back to Harold, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. He knew what Harold was asking, what he wanted to know. But Malcolm couldn't put it into words. How could he explain that after everything he was still afraid that it wasn't enough, that all the effort, the risk, the help they had received, everything, still might not be enough to save his dog? "He's not better," Malcolm muttered, barely above a whisper, his eyes still locked on the fire. "He's still too weak." "You did what you could," Harold said softly. "The rest is up to time." But Malcolm didn't believe that. Time wasn't going to save him. Time wasn't going to heal the wounds Bishop had suffered in that river. It wasn't going to make Bishop strong again. The truth was, he was terrified. The cabin felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing tighter and tighter as he tried to keep his thoughts from spiraling out of control. He ran his fingers through his hair, shaking his head. What if it's not enough? What if? He didn't finish the sentence. The thought was too overwhelming to even complete, but Harold knew what he meant. He could see the strain in Malcolm's face. "I get it," Harold said, standing up and crossing the room. "But we have to give it a chance." Malcolm turned to face him, his expression tight. "I can't just wait. I have to do something." There was silence for a moment, and then Harold sighed, his shoulders slumping with the weight of the conversation. "I understand that, Malcolm. But what are you going to do? You can't change the past. You can't go back and stop the river. What you can do is help him heal, and that means patience." "Patience isn't going to save him," Malcolm snapped, his voice sharp with frustration. "I know my dog. He's not going to just wait around and get better." He shook his head again, the anxiety rising in his chest. "I have to do something. I have to do more." Harold stepped closer, his presence calm, despite the tension in the room. "You're doing everything you can," he said firmly. "But you need to ask yourself something. Are you helping him by pushing too hard, or are you just pushing yourself into a place where you can't think clearly?" Malcolm's gaze shifted, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to accept that there was nothing more he could do. He had seen the river take everything he had ever loved. He couldn't lose Bishop, too. He couldn't lose the one thing that had kept him going through the years of isolation, the pain of the past. Bishop was everything to him. But Harold's words hung in the air, a truth he couldn't escape. He was exhausted. He had pushed himself too hard already. He couldn't keep living in the constant fear that something would go wrong. He had to accept that for now, there was nothing more he could do. "You're right," Malcolm whispered the words, feeling heavy as they left his lips. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep—" His voice trailed off the thought too much to finish. "You're doing fine," Harold said, his voice steady. "Let him rest. Let him heal." As the hours passed, the storm outside began to intensify, and Malcolm remained by Bishop's side, his mind swirling with doubts and conflicting emotions. He had done everything he could, hadn't he? Yet, as he looked down at his dog, he still couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it wasn't enough. Bishop's condition had stabilized somewhat. His breathing was no longer as labored, and his body, though still cold and stiff, seemed to be regaining some strength. But the lingering fear in Malcolm's heart refused to fade. Bishop had been through too much. The river, the cold, the fear, it was all too much for the dog to endure without serious consequences. Malcolm's fingers brushed gently through Bishop's fur as he lay on the blanket near the hearth, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He didn't know how much longer the dog could hold on. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin it was eerily quiet, except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of the wind slamming against the walls. Malcolm's thoughts kept drifting back to the moment when Bishop had been swept away, the frantic chase along the riverbank, and the helplessness that had consumed him. He couldn't let go of the fear that they hadn't done enough, that he hadn't done enough. But then in the midst of his anxiety, a shift occurred. It was subtle at first, a small movement from Bishop, a shift of his paw, a quiet groan, as if he were waking from a long, deep sleep. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. His dog was alive, and despite everything, he was still fighting. But now, more than ever, Malcolm knew he couldn't do it alone. He had done everything he could to save Bishop. He had risked his life in the river and had pushed himself to the brink of exhaustion. But now, standing there in the quiet of the cabin, he realized something profound. He needed to trust. He had to trust in something greater than his fear. He had to trust that the bond he shared with Bishop, a bond built over years of companionship and loyalty, was stronger than the river, stronger than the storm, stronger than the fear gnawing at his insides. Bishop had always been there for him, always by his side, through thick and thin. It was time for Malcolm to trust that just as he had carried Bishop through the worst moments of their lives, now it was time for Bishop to carry them both through this. Malcolm exhaled deeply, the weight in his chest slowly lifting as he let go of the tension. The fire in the hearth warmed him, and the storm outside seemed to fade into the background. For the first time in hours, he felt a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. As if sensing the change in the air, Bishop's eyes slowly opened, and his gaze locked with Malcolm's. There was something in those eyes, a quiet recognition, a shared understanding. Bishop, though weak, still trusted Malcolm. And in that moment, Malcolm realized that trust was the key to everything. He couldn't save Bishop alone. He couldn't fight the river, the storm, or the fear by himself. But together, they could make it through. They had made it this far, and they could make it the rest of the way. Malcolm gently stroked Bishop's head, his voice barely a whisper. "I trust you, boy, and I trust that you're going to get through this." Bishop's tail twitched, and for a moment it felt as if the storm outside had shifted too. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the worst of it had passed. The worst was always the waiting, the uncertainty. But now standing there, Malcolm knew one thing for sure. He had to trust in the strength of the bond between him and his dog. "We're not done yet," Malcolm said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "We've made it this far, and we're not giving up now." His hand continued to caress Bishop's fur, his fingers brushing over the damp, cold skin, but the warmth of the cabin, the crackling fire, and the stillness between them offered a sense of comfort. As long as they were together, as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm they had weathered together. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Malcolm wasn't afraid anymore. He had Bishop by his side, and that was enough. Malcolm shifted his weight and moved to the small cabinet near the door. He pulled out a blanket and wrapped it around himself before sitting back down beside Bishop. It wasn't much, but it was all they had, and that was more than enough. The dog's breathing, though still faint, began to steady. Bishop's eyes were still open, but they had lost some of the panic that had once filled them. He was settling, finding a sense of peace amidst the chaos, and Malcolm could do nothing but sit there, feeling the weight of everything he had just been through, the weight of the world itself pressing down on his shoulders. But he no longer felt alone. Bishop had carried him through the hardest parts of his life, and now it was his turn to do the same. The cabin was quiet again, save for the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling against the windows. The storm had intensified outside, its fury growing with each passing minute. But inside, a strange calm had settled over Malcolm and Bishop. The tension in Malcolm's chest had lessened, though his mind still raced with thoughts of what to do next. He knew they weren't out of danger yet. Bishop was still weak, and the storm was making it harder to think clearly. The dog had made it this far, but he needed more than warmth and comfort now. He needed care. He needed to heal. Malcolm glanced down at Bishop, who was still lying quietly on the blanket by the fire. The dog's breathing had steadied, and the faintest signs of recovery were beginning to show, but Malcolm knew better than to let his guard down. The river had nearly taken everything from him. He couldn't afford to make that mistake again. "We need to move," Malcolm muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He stood up slowly, his muscles sore from the strain of carrying Bishop earlier. The weight of exhaustion hung on him, but he couldn't rest yet, not while Bishop needed him. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but Malcolm ignored it as he made his way to the door. The storm was raging outside, the wind howling louder than before. He wasn't sure how much longer they could stay in the cabin. They would have to leave, and soon. But first he had to get Bishop up, get him moving, and get him somewhere safer. The road to the cabin was treacherous, and the storm made it even more dangerous. The last thing Malcolm wanted was to be caught out in the elements with a sick dog, but they couldn't stay here forever. The shelter was too small, and the storm would make it impossible to get any help. They had to keep moving. They had to find a way to get Bishop back to full strength. Malcolm stepped outside, pulling his coat tight against his body as he faced the storm. The wind hit him immediately, a cold gust that cut through his clothes, but he didn't flinch. He had been through worse. He had lived through the worst. He had to believe that they could make it through this too. He walked toward the truck, the tires buried in thick mud, and opened the door, scanning the area for any signs of danger. But the road was empty. There was no sign of another car or another person, just him and the storm. He turned back to the cabin and glanced through the window where Bishop was still lying by the fire. The dog was breathing steadily, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. Malcolm knew they had to get to town. He had to find some help. He didn't have the supplies he needed here, and the storm was only getting worse. They couldn't wait any longer. Turning back to the truck, Malcolm climbed inside and started the engine. The sound of the motor cutting through the howling wind was the only thing that broke the silence. As he drove down the narrow road, the truck tires slipping and sliding in the mud, he kept his eyes on the road ahead. The storm was blinding now, the rain coming down in sheets. But Malcolm didn't care. He had to get to town. He had to find a way to save his dog. The road seemed endless. The wind buffeted the truck from all sides, and the rain made it hard to see. But Malcolm kept driving his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze focused on the faint glow of lights in the distance. He wasn't sure what he would do when they got there. He didn't know who he would talk to, or how they could help. But he couldn't stop now. He had to keep going. He had made a promise to Bishop, and he wasn't going to break it. The storm only seemed to worsen as the minutes passed, the sky darkening and the wind picking up. But then as they rounded a bend in the road, Malcolm saw the faint outline of a building up ahead. It wasn't much a small, rundown clinic tucked into the corner of a dirt lot, but it was something. Malcolm's heart beat faster as he pulled up to the clinic, his truck skidding slightly on the slick surface of the road. He turned off the engine and rushed out of the truck, the rain hitting him like needles. He dashed to the door of the clinic, his hand reaching for the handle. He was soaking wet, out of breath, but he didn't care. He had made it. He had done it. He had brought Bishop this far. And now he just had to make sure he wasn't too late. Inside the clinic, the dim light of a few overhead bulbs barely illuminated the room. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the old wood floors creaked under Malcolm's feet as he hurried to the counter. Behind the desk was a middle-aged woman, her dark hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She looked up at him with tired eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice low and rough. "My dog. He's hurt. He needs help." Malcolm said, his voice frantic, his words tumbling out all at once. The woman stood up, her expression shifting from exhaustion to concern. "Bring him in," she said quickly. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He turned and ran back to the truck, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened the door, and there was Bishop, still weak, but alert, his eyes flicking up to Malcolm as he reached for him. "It's okay, buddy. We're here," Malcolm whispered gently, lifting him out of the truck. He was careful, knowing how fragile Bishop still was, but he couldn't be slow. They didn't have time. Inside the clinic, the woman ushered them into a small examination room. The walls were lined with shelves full of medical supplies, and a large metal table sat in the center of the room. The woman quickly moved to prepare the space, turning to Malcolm. The warmth of the clinic, coupled with the gentle hum of fluorescent lights above, was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded over the past few hours. Malcolm watched as the woman worked quickly and efficiently, her hands moving over Bishop with practiced ease. She took his vitals, checked his body for signs of trauma, and wrapped him in a soft, heated blanket. But no matter how much care she gave, there was still a palpable tension in the room, a weight that seemed to hang in the air. Malcolm stood by the door, his hands tightly clenched at his sides, his mind racing with the events that had led them here. The storm outside still raged, its winds howling against the building, but inside the clinic the world felt eerily still. Bishop, despite his exhaustion, seemed to perk up at the woman's gentle touch. His eyes, though tired, followed her every movement, as if sensing that the worst was over. But Malcolm knew better. The worst might be over for now, but they were far from being out of danger. The river had taken so much from him already. He couldn't let it take Bishop, too. The woman whose name he had learned was Dr. Clara Hayes, stepped back after finishing her initial examination. She turned to Malcolm, her expression serious but not unkind. "He's stable for now," she said, her voice low and measured. "But he's been through a lot. The shock to his system from the cold water and the stress, it's going to take time for him to recover fully." Malcolm nodded, though it didn't ease the tightness in his chest. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough, almost pleading. Dr. Hayes glanced at Bishop, who was now resting quietly on the table, his breathing deep and steady. "It depends," she said softly. "He'll need fluids and rest. The exposure to the cold could cause complications if we don't keep an eye on him. I'm going to administer some IV fluids to rehydrate him and help stabilize his temperature. But we'll need to monitor him for the next few hours at least." Her words hung in the air, and Malcolm's heart sank. "So it's not over yet," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Dr. Hayes looked at him with a sympathetic expression. "No, it's not over. But you've done the right thing by bringing him in. The fact that he's still with us is a good sign." Malcolm tried to hold on to her optimism, but it was hard to see the silver lining when his dog's life still hung in the balance. He'd never felt so helpless standing in that sterile clinic watching a stranger work to save the one thing that had kept him going for so long. I couldn't lose him," Malcolm said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's everything. He's been there for me through so much." Dr. Hayes gave him a small, understanding nod. "I understand," she said, her voice softening. "Animals like him, they're not just pets. They're family." Malcolm swallowed hard, his throat tight with unshed tears. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding in, how much he had needed to hear those words. He glanced at Bishop again, who was now resting quietly, his eyes fluttering closed as the sedative began to take effect. "I don't know what I'd do without him," Malcolm whispered. Dr. Hayes gave him another nod before turning back to the IV bags she was setting up for Bishop. "You've already done more than most people would have in your situation," she said. "You've given him a chance. Now we just need to make sure we don't waste it." The words, simple as they were, had a profound effect on Malcolm. He straightened up his hands now at his sides instead of clenched tightly into fists. There was still a chance. Bishop still had a chance. Malcolm had to believe that. "Thank you," Malcolm said quietly, his voice steadying as he spoke. "For helping him. For helping us." Dr. Hayes didn't look up at first, but then met his gaze. It's my job," she said simply. And though her tone was professional, there was a warmth in her eyes that made Malcolm feel like she truly understood. They were both silent for a moment, watching as Bishop lay motionless on the table, the sound of the IV drip filling the quiet room. The storm outside raged on, but for the first time in what felt like hours, Malcolm felt like he could breathe again. They weren't out of the woods yet. He knew that. But at least for now, there was hope. The storm wasn't the only thing that had been raging inside of him. His mind had been a whirlwind of fear, uncertainty, and helplessness. But now, as he stood there, he realized that he wasn't truly alone. He had Dr. Hayes' help. He had the resources of the clinic, and most importantly, he had his bond with Bishop. It was a bond that had seen them through some of the darkest moments of their lives. And it was a bond that, no matter how uncertain things seemed, could carry them through this too. After a long silence, Dr. Hayes stood up and walked over to Malcolm, offering a reassuring smile. "I'm going to monitor him for a while," she said. "You can wait in the lobby or you can stay here with him. It's up to you." Malcolm didn't hesitate. He pulled up a chair and sat down next to Bishop, his gaze fixed on the dog's face. "I'll stay here," he said softly, the words feeling right. "I'm not going anywhere." The dog's chest rose and fell more erratically, a small whimper escaping his throat. Malcolm leaned forward, his hand still resting on Bishop's fur, feeling the subtle shift in the air. "Come on, boy," he whispered, trying to reassure himself as much as the dog. "You've made it this far, don't give up now." For a moment it seemed like Bishop might settle again, the erratic breathing dying down. But then, without warning, the dog's body tensed. His back arched slightly, and the sound of him gasping for air made Malcolm's heart skip a beat. His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin as he leaned over the dog, checking his vitals once more, trying desperately to catch a glimpse of what had changed. The steady flow of the IV drip was still consistent, but the dog's body seemed to react to something that Malcolm couldn't immediately identify. His first instinct was to shout for Dr. Hayes, but before he could make a sound, the dog's head lifted slightly, his eyes fluttering open though they still seemed unfocused, distant. "Bishop," Malcolm said, his voice thick with fear. "Come on, boy, look at me." He reached down gently, cradling Bishop's face with his hands, trying to catch the dog's attention. There was a shift in the dog's gaze, a flicker of recognition that sent a flood of relief through Malcolm. But then another tremor ran through Bishop's body, and his breathing seemed to stop altogether. Malcolm's heart lurched. No, this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. "Bishop!" Malcolm exclaimed, his voice louder now, panic edging in. He shook the dog gently, his hands trembling. "Please, come on. Just breathe for me. You can't go now." He was losing control of the situation, his mind frantically grasping at any answer, any way to bring his dog back from the edge. But Bishop's body didn't respond the way it had before. He could feel the coldness in the dog's limbs, the lack of energy. This wasn't just a setback. This felt like a collapse. The tears that Malcolm had held back finally started to spill, his voice breaking as he held his dog. No, please, not like this." In that moment, he felt utterly helpless. He had done everything he could, but it wasn't enough. He couldn't fix it. It wasn't supposed to end like this. He didn't even have time to say goodbye. But then, as if in response to Malcolm's desperation, a small movement came from Bishop, a slight lifting of the dog's head, followed by a soft, pained whine. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The steady beeping of the monitors, which had gone quiet for a moment, came back to life. Dr. Hayes burst into the room, her eyes immediately assessing the situation. Her calmness in the face of Malcolm's panic was the only thing keeping him from losing control entirely. "What's happening?" Malcolm asked, his voice raw. "He stopped breathing, "I'm here," Dr. Hayes cut him off, stepping to Bishop's side with a quick, practiced motion. She checked the IV, the dog's pulse, and then placed a hand gently on his chest. "He's still with us," she said, her voice steady, though there was concern in her eyes. "He's struggling, but he's alive. I'm going to adjust his fluids. We just need to keep him calm, keep him stable." Malcolm couldn't bring himself to look away from Bishop's face, the dog's weak, shallow breathing the only sign that he was still fighting. The hours of panic and exhaustion, the fear of losing the only family he had seemed to compound in that moment. But as Dr. Hayes worked her hands, moving with precision, Malcolm could feel something else building inside him. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Hope. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but when Dr. Hayes finally looked up from the dog's side, she seemed satisfied. "He's out of immediate danger," she said, though her voice was guarded. "I've adjusted the fluids and his vitals are stabilizing. He just needs rest now." Malcolm exhaled slowly, feeling like he had been holding his breath for a lifetime. Bishop's eyes fluttered again, his body still trembling from the ordeal, but there was no denying the relief that Malcolm felt. The worst might be over. For now, Bishop had survived, and that was enough. "Thank you," Malcolm said, his voice hoarse, his gratitude overwhelming. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The hours passed slowly after Dr. Hayes stabilized Bishop. Malcolm sat beside the dog, his eyes never leaving him, his hands gently resting on his dog's side, as if that alone could keep him grounded. The storm outside continued to rage, but within the confines of the small clinic, the world felt quieter, more contained. The steady drip of the IV, the soft crackling of the heater in the corner, and the occasional sigh from Bishop were the only sounds filling the room. The tension that had gripped Malcolm's chest had loosened somewhat, but he could still feel the weight of the fear that had nearly overwhelmed him. Every breath from Bishop was a small victory, a reminder that there was still a chance for recovery. Despite the progress, Malcolm couldn't completely let go of the anxiety gnawing at him. The dog's eyes, though open, still seemed distant, as if he were trapped between consciousness and unconsciousness. The faint rise and fall of Bishop's chest was a comfort, but it was far from the steady breathing that Malcolm was hoping for. It was weak, uneven, like the dog's spirit was still struggling to reclaim itself after the trauma of the river. "Come on, boy," Malcolm whispered, his voice low and soothing. "You've got this. Just hang on a little longer." The dog let out a faint whine, a sound so small and fragile that it pierced Malcolm's heart. For a moment he thought Bishop was fading again, but then the dog's body shifted the slightest movement of his paw, stretching out in a weak attempt to find comfort. Malcolm leaned closer, his heart hammering in his chest. "Bishop," he asked quietly, his voice full of hope though it trembled with uncertainty. To his relief, Bishop's eyes flickered, focusing for a brief moment on Malcolm's face. The dog's gaze was cloudy, his pupils dilated from the sedatives, but there was something there, a flicker of recognition. "That's it, boy," Malcolm said softly, his voice breaking with emotion. "Come on, I know you can do it. You're a fighter." A few more seconds passed, and Malcolm's heart thudded in his chest as he watched for any sign of improvement. Bishop's breathing, though still shallow, seemed a little steadier now. Slowly, the dog's tail moved, a small twitch at first, but enough to make Malcolm's breath catch. "That's it," he whispered, a tear slipping down his cheek. "You're coming back to me?" It felt like a miracle watching the dog respond in even the smallest way. The terror that had seized Malcolm's heart began to recede as he realized that Bishop wasn't giving up. He hadn't given up when he was swept away by the river, and now he wasn't giving up now. Bishop let out another soft whimper, and Malcolm could hear the faint rumble of his voice, though it was barely audible. "You're getting better, I can feel it," Malcolm said, his hand gently stroking Bishop's head. "We've got this, buddy. We're gonna make it." The dog's chest rose and fell with each breath, his body still weak, but gradually finding strength. It was slow, it was tentative, but it was progress. Malcolm felt the weight of relief flood through him, though his heart was still racing, his hands shaking slightly from the intensity of the fear he had just experienced. He sat there for what felt like hours, watching Bishop, waiting for the next sign, the next little movement that would tell him the dog was getting stronger. Time seemed to stretch, and in that silence, as Malcolm's hand stayed firmly on Bishop's side, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually get through this. Bishop wasn't gone. He wasn't slipping away. He was coming back. Slowly but surely, Bishop was fighting his way back from the brink. And in that moment, as the dog's tail gave another small but significant wag, Malcolm knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone in this fight. "You're not alone either, Bishop," he whispered. "I'm right here, and we're gonna get through this together." He leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself to breathe a little easier. The storm outside was still raging, but inside the clinic, in the stillness between him and his dog, there was peace. The worst of it, the terror, the desperation, was over. It wasn't over completely. Bishop wasn't out of the woods yet. Even in his weakened state, Bishop knew who was there, and that knowledge brought a deep sense of peace to Malcolm's heart. The worst of it had passed, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Malcolm had been through too much loss in his life to take anything for granted, and the thought of losing Bishop still haunted him, even as he tried to hold on to the hope that had slowly been returning. Every moment spent with Bishop was precious now. The dog, despite his frailty, seemed to sense the shift. Slowly, with what little strength he had left, Bishop pushed himself up from the blanket. Malcolm froze, watching in awe as the dog's trembling legs found their footing. Bishop, Malcolm whispered, leaning forward as if the mere sound of his voice would bring the dog back to full strength. Bishop's head lifted slightly, and for the first time since the river, there was a spark of something in his eyes. It wasn't just survival, it was life. The simple act of standing, of pushing through the weakness, was more than Malcolm could have hoped for. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on Bishop's side, his fingers brushing against the dog's fur. "It's okay, buddy. You're all right now," he said, his voice full of relief. But Bishop, with a final effort, managed to stand, his legs shaking, but his spirit unbroken. He let out a small whine, barely audible, but enough to make Malcolm's chest tighten. The dog was still here, still fighting. It was a small victory, but to Malcolm it felt like the world. "I knew you had it in you," Malcolm said, his voice full of emotion as he rubbed Bishop's head. The dog leaned into the touch, his body still frail, but his eyes locked onto Malcolm's with the same loyalty, the same love that had always been there. It was as if nothing had changed. The bond between them had always been their strength, And now, in the face of everything they had endured, it was clear that nothing, not the river, not the storm, not the fear could break it. Malcolm let out a deep breath, his mind finally finding some semblance of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to let go of the fear that had weighed him down for so long. Bishop had made it through. They had both made it through. And in that moment, Malcolm understood something that he had never truly grasped before. Life wasn't about the battles you won or lost. It wasn't about how many times you fell or how hard the road was. It was about the moments in between, the quiet spaces where you had the chance to rebuild, to heal, and to keep moving forward. It was about the bonds that held you together when everything else seemed to fall apart. And that bond, the one that Malcolm shared with Bishop, was stronger than anything. The storm outside had finally stopped, the howling winds now replaced by the soft patter of rain against the window. It was as though the world had finally calmed, giving them both the space they needed to breathe. "We made it, boy." Malcolm whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We made it." Bishop's tail wagged faintly, just enough to let Malcolm know that the dog understood. There was still a long way to go before either of them could fully recover, but the worst was over. They had survived the river. They had survived the storm. And most importantly, they had survived together. As the fire flickered low, casting a warm glow on the room, Malcolm sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle in his bones. But it wasn't a burden. It was the weight of relief, the weight of love. He looked down at Bishop, who had finally laid back down, his head resting on Malcolm's lap. The dog's eyes were closing, the soft sound of his breathing filling the room like a lullaby. Malcolm stroked the dog's fur gently, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For once, he felt at peace. Life had thrown so many obstacles in his path, but through it all, Bishop had been there. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible tales of resilience and loyalty. Let us know what part of the plot touched you the most, and where you're watching from. Leave a comment below.